Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. Tonight, we're continuing to go through and study the Melchizedekian priesthood out of Hebrews. And we basically started off by saying that Hebrews is Paul talking to the Jewish group of people, the priests, explaining why Messiah was supposed to be superior to everyone. He's trying to do it really careful by not saying this is the way it is, because then they would reject it as being a seen doctrine. So he's trying to just go through scriptures, things that everyone would have to agree with. So in chapter 1, he talks about how the Messiah is superior to the prophets and any angel. And then in chapter 2, he's superior to man. And chapter 3, even Moses and everything that Moses did. Messiah is superior to him. And then the Sabbath rest that the Messiah gives is superior to the Jewish Sabbath in chapter 4. Chapter 5 through 9, he starts talking about the priesthoods and why the priesthood of the Messiah is superior. And we started off the study by looking at how Jesus used the quotes from Psalm 119. And you can go back and look at that in previous studies. Basically showing that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes all believe that the Messiah is the one being talked about in Psalm 119. And the Pharisees couldn't really say anything about it because their theology goes against what the scripture teaches. So they flat couldn't say anything. But Paul will quote this then and talk about how Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek, as it says in that text. So we went through chapter 5 and 6 the last two times. And what we found out is that Paul is saying that a priest has to be a man. He has to represent the same beings. He has to be part of that same family. So he has to be a real physical man to offer sacrifices to God on behalf of men. But all men are sinners, so there has to be a sacrifice to make him ceremonial clean, and then he can make a sacrifice for the rest of the people. And so what he's beginning to say at this point is, but the Messiah is God incarnate. And he's going to go through this and talk about that. So the Messiah does not need to offer a sacrifice for sins for himself, because he is the sacrifice and he's perfect. Going back to like Isaiah 53 and that kind of stuff. And so we get up to that, and he's talking about how you can't back away from this. You guys want the Messiah to come, you want God's grace, but then the Messiah comes and you all of a sudden don't like what you see. Well, there's only one Messiah, and you either accept him or you don't. It would be kind of like us going to a Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist church, whatever, and we say we love God, we're waiting for the second coming. The second coming actually happens, and somehow we didn't think it was going to be like that. And well, but obviously it is. If Baptists taught it was one way, Presbyterians taught it was another way, Methodists taught it was another way, something about the coming, and you knew for sure that your denomination was right, when Messiah came and it didn't fit what you thought, it should fit one of those others. Whichever one it fits, that was the right doctrine. So just switch churches and start following what Messiah said. And that's what Paul was trying to do. You can't just back away from this. If you've seen Messiah come, you've seen how he fulfilled the prophecies, you saw what happened with your own eyes, then you know. And there's no excuse for you not becoming a Christian. You can't just stay in the temple and go back to animal sacrifices and think that that'll cover you, because it won't. Later on, he'll say the blood of bulls and goats can't take away any sin, never could. It was all pointing to what Christ was going to say. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and go into our eSword program. And we'll look at the first half of chapter 7 today to look at. This is a very confusing set of scriptures, and a lot of people get confused on it. So let's go ahead and look at this. He's talking about Abraham being blessed by Melchizedek and the other blessings that Abraham gave. Part of the argument he gave in the previous chapter is that if God promised 3 or 4 things to Abraham, The fact that you and I are both, I'm Benjamite and you're, Judah, or Levi rather, because you're in the temple. But the fact that we're both Jews, that we both live in Israel, that there's a nation of Israel, that there's a temple, all of that proves that God fulfilled his promise to Abraham. Now, if there's other parts that haven't been fulfilled yet, those are going to be fulfilled too, like Messiah being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, even though he's born king of Israel from the line of Judah. How does that work? Maybe we don't know, but that's what it says. And you can't argue what the scripture says. So he starts talking about the Melchizedek that blessed Abraham. What he doesn't get into is the basic history, and we kind of share this in the book, that the Melchizedekian priesthood line is king, prophet, and priest all rolled together in one person. That's the way it always was until Jacob, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, split it up into 3 groups. The priestly line was to go through Levi, and then later on that got narrowed to a descendant of his, Aaron, and then later on it got narrowed from the lineage of Aaron to the lineage of Zadok, so like great-great-great-grandson. So to be a priest even today, legally, according to the law of Moses, you have to be a direct descendant of Zadok. To be a king of Israel, if they had that, to be legal according to the law of Moses, you'd have to be a direct descendant of David. So that kind of stuff is going through. So what happens is Shem, who was one of the Melchizedekian priests, kept waiting for someone of his lineage to start that nation that the Messiah would come through. We know it as Israel. Well, it never happened. One the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, the great-great-grandson, and it just the world kept getting worse and worse as it was getting close to the end of that age. A great apostasy formed, led by Nimrod, and his family took over the Japhethites in that area, built the Tower of Babel. All those things were going on, and it looked like nothing was going to happen. It looks like Satan was going to destroy everything, almost like it was at the flood hundreds of years before. But then the empire broke in two, and one of the larger groups, led by Chedorlaomer, tried to take over the 5 cities of the plains. And in the process of doing that, captured Lot. Until this point, Abraham had stayed out of this. But you don't take a family member of mine hostage and expect me to sit and not do anything. So Abraham gets his 418 people and goes after these guys, and that's probably not a great idea. That probably wouldn't work. But the Lord blessed him, and he wiped out the entire army, personally killed Chedorlaomer, and set the entire empire back. Now it'd be 20 to 40 years later before Nimrod himself would be killed and the empire completely destroyed. That's another subject and another story. But when Shem saw this, that obviously is the fulfillment. God's blessed this guy. He can't get killed. He's going to, create the nation of Israel, and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's name is changed. So that's when Shem blessed Abraham. So Shem is the Melchizedekian priest at that point. So with that in mind, as a little bit of history, that's the history from the scrolls. So let's look at this then. He's just talking about Genesis at this point. Because, again, Paul can't tell you the whole story, because if he starts to tell you too much of something that's not in Genesis, the people he's writing to are going to say, that's that wacky charismatic stuff. Those guys down the street, we've heard all that before. No, thank you. And that's one of the things we saw in the previous chapters, that he said, I have much I could tell you, but you're dull of hearing. And we talked about that last week. It doesn't mean that they're stupid. It means that they have heard this before, they've rejected it, and don't want to hear it again. It's just like if you and I disagree over some doctrine, pre-trib rapture, eternal security, holiness, or whatever, and I'm the wacky guy because I'm not part of your group, but I don't talk about my group. I simply say, well, what did Peter mean when he says you have to be holy? Well, you can't, run around and practice sin. You got to try to be kind of holy. Okay, well, what is kind of holy? What did he say? And you can't really, if you're a Christian and you claim to follow the scriptures, you can't really get around what Peter said. You can try, and then I can say, well, if Peter said that, what did Jesus mean when he said this? And you kind of get stuck. It's like, well, okay, I guess we do need to be holy, but it's probably a different definition. Oh, well, what did Paul say the definition was in 1 Corinthians 10? Well, you almost have to accept it. But the second I say there's this extra biblical book that tells you, then it's like, we're not going there. So he starts off again talking about the Melchizedek that blessed Shem. And he's going to make some very good points of it, how Melchizedek in that order is superior to Levi in that order. So he says, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. This is Genesis, I believe, chapter 14. And so that's what's going on at this point. So Salem is the old term for Jerusalem, and actually, technically, it's a small suburb. There is a place where Shem and Eber ran the school of the prophets way back when. And today, I think there's actually a church over where that used to be. But it's really close, basically in the area of Jerusalem. So anyway, so this Melchizedek, this Melchizedekian priest, was king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. So his point is, first off, the Jews are supposed to tithe, and they're supposed to tithe in the temple, to the temple, specifically to the Levitical priests. And the Levitical priests are supposed to make their living off of the tithes. So they're kind of superior to the rest of us. And so his point here is, first off, Abraham tithed, just like the Jews are supposed to tithe to Levi, but Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. So point one, Abraham recognized Melchizedek as being a father figure, someone superior, and of course it was his teacher, and he gave tithes. So that's point one, and he'll come back to that. So what does Melchizedek mean? First, by interpretation, it means king of righteousness, and after that, king of Salem, which is king of peace. So if we break this up, Melchizedek, this first part here, Malach, means king, okay? And then you can see the S or a Z, E-D-E-K or C. So Zedek means righteousness, and it also means Zadok priests. So the Zadok line, the righteous line. So it's the king of the Zadoks, it's the king of righteousness. And then peace is shalom. What's really interesting is the school of the prophets ran by Shem and Eber way back when. They referred to the one that headed this, the proper priest, as a Melchizedek. What was interesting is after Shem died, several years later, Eber, when he died, was going to pass the school on to others. He gave copies of everything to Levi in the school, and the priests and the writings all went with Levi and his kids. But he tried to maintain a school there, but it was overrun by Amorites. And what's really interesting is, if you think about it, knowing what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Amorites kind of took over, formed their own religion, and called their king, priest, prophet person, Adonizedek, which means Lord of Righteousness. So they're kind of perverting it or changing it a little bit. And the Dead Sea Scrolls do talk about Nephilim technology, how to make hybrids and stuff like that. And we're told that the Amorites, later on, the sins became full, and there were giants in the Amorite groups. So they actually believed the text and tried to pervert or use them wrongly. So it's interesting to see how there are spin-offs of the original priesthood, the original school of the prophets, into different pagan groups. And that's a whole other subject too. But anyway, so Abraham gave a tenth part of all, And the name means king of righteousness, Melchizedek. Okay, now this is the confusing part. Let me stop here and go up to verse 6 and we'll come right back, but I want you to see this. This verse here, he whose descent is not counted from them, and we're talking about Levi up here. They are the sons of Levi right here. So he whose descent is not from the sons of Levi received tithes from Abraham and blessed him that he had the promises. So the Melchizedekian priest, I want you to see this first, that blessed Abraham, and then Abraham gave the tithes, the tenth of the spoils to. So that guy is who we're talking about. He has a descent, but his descent is not counted from Levi. So this is important because of the verse 3. So he does have a genealogy. This Melchizedekian priest had a father and a mother and a certain descent, a certain genealogy. It just wasn't Levitical because Levi wasn't even born yet. So with that in mind, let's go back and look at this. So Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Abraham gives tithes to him. The interpretation is that it's king of righteousness or king-priest combination, Melchizedek. Verse 3 says, and we should say it, but it's without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Now, at that point, we read this, and many people look at it and say, well, this has to be a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, or an angel of some sort. Because number one, who among us has never had a father, mother, or descent? You could say, well, at that time, his mother and father died, and he didn't have a mom or dad anymore. And that's not the way the text reads, but also descent or genealogy. He doesn't have any genealogy. Okay, well, that's not human. Okay, but in previous chapters, he said if you're going to be a priest, you have to be a human being because you have to offer sacrifices for yourself first to be purified and then for the sins of the people. And it's not something that anybody can just pick. God picks the people to do that. He picked someone to start the Melchizedekian line. He picked someone to start the Levi line. He picked Aaron to start the Aaronic line. He picked Zadok to start the Zadok line. They didn't just say, hey, I think I can do this better. I'll take it over. It has to be picked by God. So with all that in mind, we know it can't be a Christophany. So what does this mean without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life? It's a very, very cryptic thing and people get confused. It's talking about not a person, but the priesthood. And they'll make it clear in the second part of chapter 7. But let me explain this to you because the order of Levi, according to Numbers, you have to be a direct descendant, both your mom and dad, of the Levitical line, if you're going to be high priest. Regular priest, not so much, but high priest. And you have to be have the proper genealogy. You have to show that you are direct descendant going all the way back through Zadok, through Aaron, through Levi, or you can't be high priest. It has a beginning of days. You can't serve before you're 30 years old. Okay, and then it has an end of life or a mandatory retirement. So with this in mind, he's going to contrast these, and it's a very, very important point. Let me flip over just to show you. We'll go back to here, and here is the book, Ancient Order of Melchizedek, and there's a couple quotes in here. I just thought I would show these to you. Here's Numbers 3, 6, and 7, talking about the Levitical priesthood, and it says this: bring the tribe of Levi near and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may minister to him. And they shall keep his charge, the charge of the whole congregation, before the tabernacle of the congregation to do service in the tabernacle. So the firstborns were replaced by Levitical priest. Now look at what it says here. Here's Numbers 8, 24 and 25. This is it that belongs to the Levites. This is their inheritance and how they are supposed to function. From 25 years old and upward, they shall go in and wait upon the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. From the age of 50 years they shall cease waiting on the service thereof, and shall serve no more. So there's different rankings of priests in different times and all, but basically 25 to 50. And so some people say that there's a 5-year training period, and the actual serving as priest is 30 to 50, 20-year period. Either way, you can see here how there's a starting point. There's a minimum age. You have to be an adult their way, which is at least 25 or more. And there's a mandatory retirement. So with this then in mind, then let's go back to here. So the Melchizedekian line, however, is different. The Melchizedekian line is without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So what he's contrasting here is this. Somebody might argue that, well, Jesus, could serve as priest, but there's a mandatory retirement. As soon as Jesus becomes 50, he's not qualified. You could say he died and he came back, but right now he's still alive, but he's more than 50 years old, right? Close to 2000, right? So how does that, or over 2000, actually 2022 or something like that. He's a very old priest. The point is, Levitical priests have a mandatory retirement, but a Melchizedekian priest, like Shem, for instance, might live hundreds of years. So that priesthood could go on serving for hundreds of years. It's only turned over to someone else if that priest wanted to for some reason, or, which we see in some of the ancient histories, or was nearing old age and death and wanted to make sure the proper person had it. So it's to whomever it would be, usually a descendant of theirs, but it doesn't have to be a certain descent, firstborn of a firstborn of a firstborn. If those guys are weird, then I'm going to take the godly guy. I will pick. And so that's the way a Melchizedekian thing works. And so the point he's going to make later is that Jesus, since he's eternal, is going to continue to be our priest forever. And so it can't be messed up. It's done. Satan's lost, and the Lord has saved us, and we're saved, and we're eternally saved for that point. So the whole contrast here is, if he was a Levitical priest, it couldn't have worked that way. And remember, that's what he's doing. Jesus is superior to the prophets, to Moses, to the laws, to the ceremonies, to the Levitical priesthood, to the sacrifices, and on down. So this is what he says then. So the Melchizedekian priesthood is without father, mother, descent, having neither beginning to days nor end of life, but made like to the Son of God, abides a priest continually. So the priesthood, since it doesn't have a mandatory end, being made like the Son of God, or in other words, the Son of God is now that priest, it abides a priest continually, and so does he. He will abide as a priest continually. So there's no way to get this messed up. Then he goes on in verse 4 and says, now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of spoils. Abraham is a king priest. He's runs his own, basically like the king of a nation, right? So if your president actually goes before someone else and bows down to them, they'd have to be a pretty great person. So consider how great this particular Melchizedekian priest was, because Abraham actually tithed to him or gave him spoils. So, and here's his point. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have the commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, Mosaic law, that is, of their brethren, though they come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them, actually their descent is counted from him. So it's the other way around, because he's greater. Received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. Without all contradiction, the less is blessed by the better, or the greater. And here, men that die receive tithes, but there rather, he receives them to whom it is witnessed that he lives. So the Melchizedekian priesthood, now Jesus, continues. And as I may so say, Levi also received tithes, who received tithes, the Levitical priesthood, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So his whole point is, if you're part of the proper priesthood, the great priesthood, you're a direct descendant of Zadok. And Zadok is slightly inferior to Aaron because it's his great-great-great-grandson, right? And so Aaron is slightly inferior to Levi because it's his grandson. Levi, Kohath, Amram, and then Aaron. So 4 generations. So then we go back to Jacob and to Isaac and then to Abraham. So Abraham is somewhat inferior to Shem at this point because he's the 10th generation from Noah, or the 9th generation from Shem. So look at everything we're showing here. First off, he's saying that Melchizedek is not the same thing as Levi. The priesthoods are different. The orders are different. The order is different because the order is older. It didn't come from the Levitical order. The Levitical order came from the Melchizedekian order when it was broke up. So it is greater. So if Christ is a Melchizedekian priest, then the laws around the priesthood of Levi don't apply to him. So the mandatory retirement is irrelevant. Okay. The fact that he was born of the tribe of Judah makes him king, but he can still be a priest because there's no genealogy requirement for a Melchizedekian priest. This all seems complicated, but again, Paul is trying to go around this stuff using the laws that they use to point out that Christ has to be the Melchizedekian priest. It has to be done. It has to be here. You've seen it. There's no way around it. So he's trying really hard not to do anything that they would say, well, that's Essene theology. That's Sadducee theology. We don't care about that kind of stuff. But you care about Scripture. Numbers says there's a mandatory retirement. Not so with Melchizedekian. And Christ is ever living. The Messiah was supposed to resurrect from the dead, Scriptures say. So it goes on and on with us. Now we'll stop at verse 10 for tonight, so we can leave you with that and think about it. Now verses 11 through 25 here, 28 actually, we'll do next time. But he's going to start talking with that in mind. He's got that down. The Levitical priesthood and the order, and we'll see it here. The order of Melchizedek he's called out of the order of Melchizedek, not the order of Aaron. So he's trying to make you understand the concepts of the orders. So this all makes perfect sense. The only thing that's confusing is verse 3, when it says, without father, mother, descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. If you think that's talking about a person, that's really confusing. When you understand it's talking about the order, it all of a sudden makes perfect sense. And that's Paul's basic argument. Now he'll go on and explain other things that way. So far in 5, 6, and 7, he said to be a priest, you have to be a man because you've got to offer an offering for men. You have to be sinless, at least ceremonially. Jesus was perfectly sinless, offered himself. So they all point to the real one. You have seen the prophecies. You can't back out of it now and not be blamed. If you reject Christ because it's not what you thought it was going to be, you're going to suffer eternally. And then he begins to contrast the Melchizedekian order with the Levitical order. First point is mandatory retirements. No one person can continue forever to be a priest. It's illegal according to the law of Levi, but it is okay for the law of Melchizedek. And Jesus was born of Judah. He doesn't mention that here, but that would be illegal for a Jew, a Judahite, somebody of the tribe of Judah, to serve as priest because it has to be Levi, as we read in Numbers. So again, contrasting all this together, really, really interesting. When we go through the second half of chapter 7 and then get into chapter 8, he'll kind of tie all that together and continue to show all the differences and the superiority of everything Jesus does. The temple and the temple vessels represent things that are heavenly. And so you can't say that the blood of bulls and goats save you, or that Abraham will save you, or anything else. It has to be Messiah. So we'll continue this next time. So now we will go to the chat room and see if there's any questions about this. I'm just trying to go point by point and kind of go a little slow because those are controversial, not really controversial, but confusing passages. So let's take a second here. Prescott says, I'm glad Hebrews 7:3 has finally been explained to me. Yeah, it is. It's very confusing, isn't it, when you first look at it? But it really helps to go back to Numbers 8, the mandatory retirement part. And then that really helps to understand. Also said, I find it interesting how the tithing amount always stays the same. Yeah, there's a lot of things like that that's interesting. A lot of people that want to follow the law will bring those points out that they did parts of the law way before the law of Moses, came. So there was a 7-day order, but we see that in creation. We see that in the calendar. A tithe is the same as a tenth. It's pretty interesting. The priests did the same kind of sacrifices, slightly different from my understanding. Things like that. The Levitical priesthood, if you go back and look through Levi or Leviticus and Numbers, and that will tell you a little bit about the spices, like frankincense, for instance, and other things. But the Melchizedekian order, if you go back to like the Testament of Noah and the Testament of Abraham, they will describe a little bit of how they did the sacrifices or what was the things that they used to make the sacrifice. So there'd be a bull or a goat or a lamb or something like that. But then they'd have the spices. And what's interesting is that they were all evergreens. And of course, evergreen symbolizes eternal life. Today, we have a lot of people that get upset if you have an evergreen of any kind, especially in the winter, Christmas tree, wreath, or something like that. They'll say it's pagan. Well, it's an old memory of the symbol of eternal life. And maybe in Scandinavia, they had it round and somebody else had a triangle for the Trinity and somebody else did this, but it all goes back to that. What I thought was interesting was, according to the testaments of Noah and Abraham, they used 7 spices or 7 different kinds of evergreens. Sometimes the spices were resins from the evergreens, but somehow it always went back to an evergreen. Frankincense was one. Myrrh was, I think, another one. But anyway, and I don't know that we have a record of all 7, but it was interesting that there were 7 separate spices used in the sacrifices. So very interesting. So there's a lot of stuff like that. You go back and you look at it. Like, for instance, another thing is today we have people that don't want to get married. They say it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't really matter. And you go back at it and you think, well, the Jews always got married. Gentiles didn't necessarily. Romans did, but some of the Greeks didn't. So, using that train of thought, are we supposed to, or is that Jewish tradition that we don't have to follow, that kind of thing? And another interesting thing is if you go back to the Testament of Noah, he mentions that he married, what his first thought was he had heard that the end of the world was coming. So there's no sense of getting married and having kids if we're all going to die. So just forget about it. And that was his attitude, not in a bad way, but just, I don't want to do this if this is what's going to happen. I just don't want any part of it. So the God spoke to his heart, and he understood that it's going to happen, but a remnant is going to survive. And it's actually going to be him and his sons. So he does need to get married and he does need to have children. So in the process of explaining that in his testament, he said that he married his wife, and he did it according to the order laid down of old, the ceremony. So there was an actual marriage ceremony. Now, how that was the same or different from a Jewish wedding, I don't know, because he didn't describe it. But it was interesting to see that whole concept of, from time immemorial, a man and a woman get together. They're sons and daughters of somebody, so they have to have permission, or should have permission, and they get married, and there's some sort of a ceremony, whether it's written on paper or whatever, but there's some sort of a ceremony so everybody knows those two are a couple. You leave them alone. And so, in holiness. So it's interesting that way. They're not supposed to get divorced. They're not supposed to get married without both sets of parents saying it's okay, because you want it to last, etc. And so Noah said that he did it according to the old instructions handed down. So pretty interesting. So we're still trying to go through, and I would love to find what those instructions were, and have a marriage ceremony accordingly, that kind of thing. But I don't think it matters so much exactly how you do a wedding. We all do it slightly different, with sometimes different vows. But the fact that we get married and it's recognized the proper way in whatever society you live, however you get married legally in England and Scotland and Wales and United States. So really interesting. Let's see here. And then Diane says, so glad the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed this truth. So many teach that Melchizedek was a person or was Jesus. Yeah. And that kind of messes it up a little bit. But I think when you look at it, you can kind of see where Paul's going with most of it. He's talking about the order. And somehow the Jews would have understood Jesus is superior to whatever stuff that they're thinking. And so that's pretty interesting. But to know this is really helpful. See, what's interesting to me is that the scrolls talk about, here is the basic information, and you should be able to figure most of it out. But there will be a Benjamite that writes a series of epistles in the covenant canon of the canon of the new covenant when it comes. And he will explain everything. So they were looking at the epistles of Paul coming in the future that would actually explain everything and put everything right. They probably understood it the same way, but be nice if somebody would flat out say that, because the apostasy was going on. So you've got the Talmudic interpretations of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the other subgroups that were going on. So they're looking forward to that. We have forgotten all of that history and what was going on. And we look at the epistles of Paul and we understand the gist of what he's saying, most of it. But some of the specifics we don't know because we forgot what the questions were. So now it's neat for us to go back and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and say, oh, okay, this was going on. These guys were teaching this. This was the thought. And then we go back and we read Paul, and sure enough, Paul does really answer everything. There's a few confusing things Galatians is another example. He gives you like 5 or 6 examples of the law, and 2 of them are kind of confusing. The other 3 make sense, and you kind of get the idea that all 5 of them probably teach the same thing. And you're right, you understand it fine, but you don't get the 2 or 3 of the odd parts. And so same thing with Hebrews, like in this particular place. So really good. Let's see here. Yeah, the movie Before the Wrath makes a lot of things clear considering the Galilean wedding. That's another example too. We think of a wedding as how we do it here in America, or I do. And that particular one, Before the Wrath, it shows what the Galilean wedding ceremony was. And if it was actually that way, you can understand when Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you and come again, and the bride being lifted up and carried to where the groom is, and the shutting of the doors and the gnashing of teeth and all those kind of things. It makes sense according to that wedding ceremony. So, and Jesus is not trying to be cryptic. He's trying to use everyday things to make it super, super clear, because he's not trying to hide things. He's trying to explain. And we just get confused sometimes because our traditions are different, so we don't know what he's saying. And one example that I used to use a lot, still do, is here in America. All the Americans will know this, and some of you guys outside the country will too. But we have a thing called a driveway, and it's a concrete slab at our home where we park our car. And then there are freeways where you can go for a long time super fast. Some of those freeways are called parkways. And so if you look at it and think, why do we drive on a parkway and park on a driveway? Doesn't make sense. It's just one of those weird idioms that we have in this country. But my example is, suppose 1,000 years from now, somebody digs up a manuscript and they're trying to figure out what these idioms mean. And the experts break the words up and say, well, it's obvious. You park your car on a parkway and you drive fast on a driveway. It's where they, what else would it mean? Well, they're actually got it backwards. So what you want to do is not guess at the idioms, but find an ancient manuscript that says that. Somebody saying that my car was too heavy, and so the concrete collapsed, so I had to make a new driveway. Wait, don't you mean parkway? No, driveway. So with enough manuscripts, you'll find out for sure what the idioms mean. So, and that's what we're trying to do. So, okay. Short teaching tonight then. I'll ask if there's any more questions. And we will not be here Thursday. We were supposed to go to Prophecy Watchers to do a TV spot on this book last Thursday and Friday, but they had an ice storm down there and they were without power for a couple of days, so we had to cancel. So we're going down this week instead. So pray for our safe trip and that everything go well. So we won't have our normal Q&A this Thursday, but we'll come back again next Monday and finish chapter 7 of Hebrews. So, okay, any other quick questions before we go? Well, I thank you guys for all coming, and we'll continue to do these things. Oh, one thing I did notice is that we are quickly getting close to our 20,000 mark. Tonight we're at like 19,600, right at 600. And so only got about 400 to go. So by this time next week, I'm sure we'll have over 20,000 followers on YouTube. So that'll be fantastic. So, all right. Well, I'll go ahead and say good night then. And we will see you next Monday. God bless and have a safe weekend.